What's up, folks? Mike for CMCC Builds here with optimizing Critical Role, and the final word on monks? Let's be honest, probably not. Before we talk about optimizing the Beauregard monk build, we need to discuss the most common monk critiques and even those more uncommon claims that monks are overpowered. Because if we can't agree on what works and what doesn't, what's powerful and what isn't, then it's going to be very difficult to identify any decent optimization options. If you're looking for a damage-based analysis on monks, you can find part 1 and 2 of the monk DPR analysis here or linked in the description below. Since the best single video I've seen on all the weaknesses of monks comes from Treant Monk, I'm going to use his video as the basis for the monk critiques. This doesn't mean I don't like Chris or his channel, quite the opposite actually, but I do feel he is quite off base on his monk assessment, especially post Tasha's where monks received a substantial power boost. Yes, I know that his video was made before Tasha's was a thing, but he's discussed monks plenty since then and hasn't seemed to change his tune much. And other channels like Monkey DM or even Colby from D4 have been quite critical of the monk in the post-Tasha era. Is it warranted? Who's right? Well, let's see. A friendly reminder that if you want to vote on upcoming builds, have access to write-ups and character sheets of all my builds, or just support the channel, I have a Patreon linked in the description below. Let's dive in. One of the first critiques monks face is the claim that they do a lot of things, but they're not particularly good at any one thing. They don't excel at anything. Attached to this claim is the idea that discussing the various things that they're good at is somehow moving the goalposts. If the initial claim is about monks delivering damage, and then shifts to their tanking, and then their movement, that this is somehow not an argument for their well-roundedness, but instead simply shifting the discussion away from the original topic. I think everyone agrees that monks do a lot of things. They deal damage, they kite with their movement, control enemies with stunning strike, and can tank. The point of disagreement tends to be how well they can do any one of those things. Let's start with DPR. As seen here and here, monk builds can not just surpass the baseline, and my baseline uses custom lineage so it's a bit higher than even Treant Monk's baseline, but some of the better monk builds, like the optimized Shadow Monk or the Gun Monk, can crush that baseline. The Gun Monk specifically can double that baseline over the life of the character. The Gun Monk, as seen in my 5-minute builds video here, can double that baseline over the life of the character. Tied to this DPR claim is that monk's damage scales poorly, specifically with the martial arts die starting at a D4 and taking 18 levels to max out at a D10, and that is, or more accurately was, true. But again, post Tasha's, it's just not an issue. Dedicated weapon at level 2 means that a monk can dip 1 level in fighter for martial weapon proficiency and use a longsword with 2 hands, getting that D10 damage right at level 3. Or if that's too long to wait, take a race like Githyanki and get longsword proficiency right at level 1, and at level 2 use dedicated weapon to turn it into a monk weapon so you use dex instead of strength for attack and damage rolls. So yes, monks can do solid damage, and no, the poor scaling of the martial arts die doesn't hold them back or even matter much at this point. We have 3 clear examples of monk builds that can do strong damage: the Mercy Monk, the Shadow Monk, and the Gun Monk. Okay, but monks are mad, right? Multi-attribute dependent? Too mad, in fact. They need to have high dexterity, wisdom, and constitution scores to be good, right? Well, no. The Gun Monk can forego wisdom in the same way that plenty of 2-stat classes can forego their secondary stat. There is nothing unique about this. All builds need a respectable constitution score. It's the secondary or tertiary stat for nearly every build. And some builds need to focus on both main stats to function properly. Are monks even more mad than other classes? Most but not all ranger builds need the exact same stats: dex, wisdom, and con. Most but not all paladins need strength, charisma, and con. And Dexidans need dex, charisma, strength, and con. Yikes. Blade singers need dex, intelligence, and con. Swords bards need dex, charisma, and con. Same with valor bards. Yep, hexblade can help, but puts you a level behind, which does matter. Even unarmored barbarians need strength, con, and dex to function well. So are they actually any more mad than any of the other mad classes, subclasses, and builds out there? Not particularly, and not even necessarily. Okay, but monks are terrible tanks, right? Well, yeah, at tier 1 and 2, they're not particularly good tanks. Their AC isn't very high, they don't have a ton of hit points, and their saves are nothing special. But in tier 3, that changes quite a bit. First, assuming no magic items, by level 12 a monk should have a very solid 19 AC, and going into tier 4 that should cap at 20, again with no magic items. That's the same AC as the full plate wearing shield bearers, so the idea that monks can't match ACs with the best martials, especially at later levels, is just wrong. We'll get into magic items later, but yes, there are available magic items that can supplement monks in the same way that magic armor and shields can help other martials. And saving throws? How about potentially the best saving throw ability in the game? If it's not, it's right at the top. Diamond Soul gives the monk proficiency in every single saving throw and the ability to re-roll a failed saving throw for only 1 key point. Yes, this comes online at level 14, which is late, especially compared to the Paladin's Aura feature at level 6, but again, monks change roles as they progress. Monks are not tanks in tier 1 and 2, they're glass cannons. They don't start with ACs as high as other tanks, they don't have the defense fighting style, and their saves aren't fortified, yet. But in tier 3 and 4, they are excellent tanks. So yes, Treant Monk is right that monks make bad tanks in tier 1 and 2, but they shouldn't be tanks in tier 1 and 2. They're tanks in tier 3 and 4, and they make excellent tanks, better than most, but probably not all. Barbarians likely still have the edge even in late tiers, and if you're concerned that you've spent your ASI feat resources for one role only to have it switched in later tiers, remember, you're taking ASIs, not feats, to boost dex and wisdom. It doesn't matter if you switch roles, you're building for all roles with those ASI. But I left out hit points. Monks only have a D8 hit die, which is just too low for a tank or a mad character, right? A D8 is certainly worse than the Barbarian's D12 or the Fighter, Ranger, Paladin's D10, but plenty of melee builds and even tanks use a D8 or lower. Clerics use a D8 and they can tank with the best of them. The Arcana Cleric makes a fantastic tank for a variety of reasons that we saw in one of my previous videos. The Spellsword build on this channel makes an excellent tank and combines a D10 and a D6 hit die from Fighter and Wizard with a nearly 50-50 split in levels. That's an average of a D8. Blade Singers can certainly tank if they want. They use a D6 hit die. That's even worse. And there are plenty of other melee builds that use a D8. The Hexblade uses a D8. Not a traditional tank, but certainly right in the thick of things. Sorkadins use a D10 and a D6 and often have a 6-14 level split, leaning toward the Sorcerer, so they have less than a D8. Again, not a traditional tank, but certainly a melee build. And in addition to all these abilities, monks can take the dodge action as a bonus action. Although it does eat a resource in the amount of 1 key point, giving all attacks disadvantage is a very strong tanking ability, especially with that D8 hit die. And in the right situation, is certainly helpful. So the monk's hit die is middle of the road or perhaps on the lower end, but it's certainly usable, especially when combined with the monk's other features. And at level 4, monks even get quickened healing just to give monks that second wind-esque type of feature. It's not particularly good, but it can help in a pinch and does provide a slight boost to the monk's weakest aspect of their tanking ability in the form of additional hit points. One of the strange things I noticed in Treant Monk's video is that he makes a huge point to say that monks do fine according to his calculations with DPR in early tiers, but they tend to trail off in later tiers. Watch my DPR videos to see why this is actually incorrect, at least according to my calculations, but let's assume it's accurate. He also makes a point to show that monks are terrible tanks early on, and then in tier 3 and 4 get a 20 AC and excellent saving throws, making them at worst fine tanks and at best excellent tanks, especially with minor healing abilities, patient defense, deflect missiles, etc. The answer is right there. Change your role. Be offensively focused in early tiers and defensively focused in later tiers. You don't need to build for this change, it happens with the monk's new abilities. Just pump dex and wisdom and let the tankiness wash over you as you approach tier 4. And of course, you have the Gunk build in the corner over there, not caring one bit about any of this. It'll be a strong damage dealer from tier 1 to tier 4. You never need to enter melee, so at range, hit dice don't matter nearly as much, same with AC, and the saving throws will be fortified at Monk 14, just like all the other high-level monks. What about Stunning Strike? Is it good or completely overrated? Well, I dove into this topic in the first 2 videos. Stunning Strike is an action economy free ability that only costs 1 key point, of which a monk will have 10 to 15 when they get this ability, depending on if you use 1 or 2 short rests per long rest models. It can be used multiple times per turn, which greatly increases the chances of a single Stunning Strike landing, and 1 strike landing should mean that the enemy just flat dies before it can act again. Treant Monk himself has a recent video showing how easy it is to kill Vecna before Vecna has a chance to take a turn with just 2 arcane archers. 2. And it's Vecna. Now do a 4 or 5, or in the case of critical roles, 7 or 8 person party, and actually optimize those characters. Good luck surviving that. I understand Vecna has legendary resistances and is immune to the stun condition, but the point remains. Very powerful creatures can be killed quickly when they don't have a chance to act. Now, how many creatures like Vecna are immune to the stun condition, or like the Mercy Monk, have the ability to end the condition? Not many. As of this video, according to D&D Beyond, 80. 80 of 2,453 listed creatures, that's 3.3%, have immunity to the stun condition. Compare that to the poison condition's 695 immune monsters, which is more than a quarter of all monsters. Stunned isn't the most powerful or least resisted condition, but it's certainly top 3. Beyond incapacitated and unconscious, There is an argument that Paralyzed is a better condition. It's certainly more powerful when it lands, but more than 4 times the amount of creatures are immune to that condition. What about magic weapons and feats? Other martials have weapons and armor, so they have all those chances to get magic weapons and magic armor and weapon-specific feats. Monks are at such a disadvantage there, right? Well, no. Believe it or not, monks are awesome with magic weapons. And now, as we talked about, they can be really awesome with weapons, especially ranged weapons. So feats like Sharpshooter do apply. They can now use a ton of weapons by level 2, so most of those magic weapons can now apply too. Paraphrasing from my buddy Ludic, who I've mentioned on this channel before, go check out his builds, monks tend to not care much about the kind of weaponry they're using, especially later on when the martial arts die scales. And they can do 2 to 3 attacks with a weapon, and can get in more consistently than typical martials. When you start looking at some of the weapons, they boost damage per hit into the stratosphere, which means, you guessed it, stuff like Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master become less valuable. The reason for this is that when you do more damage per hit, naturally you want to hit more. As that per hit damage increases, approaching or even surpassing the plus 10 from Sharpshooter or Great Weapon Master, the negative effect of that negative 5 to your attack roll grows until it's no longer optimal to even use the negative 5 plus 10 feature, or even build around it. The fact that monks get up to 4 attacks right at level 5 while other martials have between 2 and 3 until level 11 makes items with bonuses to damage especially useful for monks. For a particularly extreme example, the Hammer of Perforos from Mythic Odyssey of Theros adds plus 3d10 plus 3 damage per hit on top of a plus 3 to attacks. It also lets a monk concentrate on animate objects, which skyrockets their DPR. For a significantly less extreme or rare example, Dragonhide belts are uncommon and they are very strong for monks. A plus 1 to plus 3 to their save DC really pumps up the already excellent stunning strike, and a martial arts die roll worth of extra key points does wonders to shore up one of the true weaknesses of the class: too few key points at early levels. The Eldritch Claw tattoo gives a plus 1 to all unarmed attacks all the time, and for 1 minute gives plus 1 to hit and plus 1d6 plus 1 extra damage on all unarmed attacks. That's another uncommon magic item. The legendary Blood Fury tattoo can burn charges for a plus 46 per hit and lets you use an attack and therefore stunning strike as a reaction with advantage when someone hits you, which potentially cuts the rest of their turn short. The Staff of Defense, a rare item which is obtainable in one of the most popular and earliest campaigns in 5e, which I won't name due to spoilers, is a quarterstaff that monks can use that gives a plus 1 passive AC and lets you cast shield up to 5 times per day, and it can be used as a magical monk weapon. Bracers of Defense give a plus 2 to AC if you're not wearing armor or a shield, perfect for a monk. The list goes on. Magic items are not an issue for monks, at least not anymore. Okay, now for a point of concession. The monk's over-reliance on a limited resource. Key. This is a completely fair point. Most monk features pull from the same resource pool, unlike sorcerers with sorcerer points, clerics and paladins with channel divinities, warlocks with invocations, and even rangers now have free casting of spells as a class feature. But with monks, everything uses key. And there's not a lot of key, at least not at the early levels. But as a monk progresses and those key points add up, this becomes less and less of an issue until tier 3 and 4, where it will very likely be a non-issue unless that party takes little to no short rests. With 10 plus key points up to 3 times per day, with only 2 short rests, key points are very likely to be plentiful. To add to that, with the release of the well-designed Mercy Monk subclass and optional features like Key-Fueled Attack, monk abilities now stack on top of other features that use key points. This way, a single usage of key can now trigger multiple features. This helps quite a bit to reduce tier 2 key usage, which leaves only tier 1 as a true weakness in terms of key usage. I should also mention features like Deflect Missiles, Slow Fall, Evasion, Stillness of Mind, and Purity of Body. These are all defensive abilities, none of which are particularly great, some clearly better than others, but none bad. What they do is add minor pieces to the monk's defense. Treant Monk washes them all away by basically saying, and I hope I'm not strawmanning here, because none of these are great, or in his estimation particularly good, they don't add much to the monk chassis. But here's the thing, if a feature is adding to your abilities, and each feature continues to add even minutely to that area, in the end, you may end up with a class that is actually very strong in that area. That tier 3 transition from Glass Cannon to Tank for the monk doesn't happen right at level 14, it happens incrementally over time, starting with those aforementioned abilities. Each adds a tiny piece that by 14 finalizes the transition. And finally, the one area that monks clearly excel and surpass all other classes is their hypermobility. And yes, at level 1 you can buy a horse and get 60 foot speed, but mounts can die, and in most cases they can die fairly easily. And mounts must be one size larger than you, so for the vast majority of medium-sized PCs that means a large mount. Large mounts will run into plenty of mobility issues when trying to navigate through narrow passages and all those dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons. On top of that, mounts share your initiative but not your turn. If you want to move in between attacks or in between actions and bonus actions, that becomes much more difficult to do unless you plan ahead with held actions. Mounts are great, but they're not the equivalent of the PC simply having that move speed. Okay, so with all that said, that must mean Critical Role is right, and monks are OP. They're overpowered. Except overpowered means that a class or subclass is so powerful that it overshadows other classes, thus throwing the game balance out of whack, and there is nothing in the abilities I discussed with monks that does anything close to that. Monks don't break the game. They're not remotely overpowered, because spellcasters exist, and every single spellcasting class is more powerful than the monk class. Why is that? Because spells. They're that good. As is usually the case, neither extreme is correct, and the truth lies somewhere in between. The monk does not suck. The monk is not OP. The monk is a fine non-spellcaster. Does Key need a rework? Probably. And with short rests going the way of the dodo in 5.5, I'll be very interested to see what Wizards does to solve this problem. See you here next time, folks.